With U.S. entry into World War I in April of 1917, the military would need more manpower. African American men joined the multitudes of men who answered the call to register for the military draft. In entering the war, President Woodrow Wilson declared the U.S. would stop German atrocities, including submarine warfare. Later, he coined the phrase, "Make the world safe for democracy," to summarize the American cause. African Americans carried additional motivations. Black leaders encouraged African Americans to serve as an opportunity to achieve greater democracy and racial progress in the U.S. In the decades prior to the war, white-controlled state governments, particularly in the South, enacted laws that enforced the already customary subordination of African Americans. These Jim Crow laws impacted the daily lives of African Americans as whites used various strategies like poll taxes and literacy tests to disenfranchise the political rights of blacks. Jim Crow laws also restricted where they could live and enforced segregation in schools, public facilities, and public transportation between whites and blacks. These laws, along with racial violence, such as public executions or lynchings of African Americans by mobs of whites, served as a reminder to African Americans of their second-class status in American society. In proving their loyalty to America and their bravery in the heat of battle, African Americans hoped their service would force the nation to acknowledge their citizenship. Ultimately, nearly 400,000 African Americans served in the military during World War I, playing an unheralded role fighting to preserve and even extend democracy both at home and abroad. African Americans experienced constant racism throughout their service. The military reflected American society. The military segregated black soldiers and subjected them to racial discrimination. Despite their willingness to fight to protect American values, the military restricted black participation in the war. Blacks could not join the Marines. The Navy limited black sailors to menial positions serving food and cleaning up after Navy officers. By default, most black World War I soldiers served in the Army. Black soldiers dealt with racist notions that suggested their unfitness to serve in combat. Many white citizens expressed fears that armed black soldiers would use their military training to start a racial war upon returning home. In response, the Army limited most black draftees to non-combat units that required minimal to no training with firearms. To prevent black majorities in certain areas, the Army maintained a white majority in each training camp. Thus, the Army moved black draftees to various camps throughout the country. While training at the same bases as whites, segregation remained enforced. Whether in the U.S. or overseas in France, racism shaped black soldiers' military experiences. Black leaders continued to seek greater opportunities to prove themselves and their race in combat. In their view, how could African Americans prove their patriotism and courage under fire if they saw no frontline duty? In response to black leaders' agitations, the War Department created two black combat divisions, the 92nd and the 93rd Divisions, who served overseas in France. Moreover, black leaders argued that black soldiers should be given the opportunity to command. Through their efforts, the War Department also established a black officer camp at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, in June of 1917 with 1,250 candidates. By October, 639 of these candidates received their commissions in the Army as part of the first black officer class. While black officers served within black combat units, the Army restricted them to junior positions, as white officers maintained senior positions within these units. Despite dealing with constant charges of cowardice and ineptness, black officers endured, persevered, and led their men to the best of their ability. With fighting occurring in Europe, the Army began transporting troops overseas. In France, black soldiers provided both labor and combat support. The Army assigned most black troops to service in labor battalions, loading and unloading cargo, building ditches, constructing and repairing roads, and burying the dead. Furthermore, nearly 40,000 black troops fought in combat. 4 black infantry units of the 93rd, including the famed 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, fought under French command. Here is some footage of the 369th Regiment training with French helmets, rifles, and equipment issued by the French Army. The French gladly accepted these African American combat units, as the French Army needed men after suffering heavy losses over more than 3 years of war. The French also had black troops from their African colonies in their ranks, so black troops would not have been an unwelcome sight for French soldiers. The 93rd Division saw significant action on the front lines. For instance, the 369th served 191 days on the Western Front, the longest of any American regiment. Here is some footage of the 92nd Division. Unlike the 93rd Division, the 92nd Division remained under American command and saw limited action in combat. Military officials often used minor incidents of failures by black combat units as evidence of their unreliability on the battlefield, despite the role that poor training, equipment, and unfamiliar territory played. Still, black soldiers served honorably and fought bravely. The 92nd Division participated in the Meuse-Argonne offensive against German forces, an offensive that ultimately ended the war with the Allied forces' victory. The French awarded the Croix de Guerre to individual black soldiers along with 3 black regiments and 1 company who served with distinction fighting alongside French troops immediately after the war. On the other hand, while some black soldiers received various American awards, the U.S. awarded the first Medal of Honor to a black World War I soldier decades after the war ended, finally acknowledging both the bravery of black troops and the role racism played in the war and the award process. As black troops returned home in 1919, units like the New York's 369th Regiment returned to a hero's welcome. Marching down the streets of New York City, multitudes of white and black Americans came out to celebrate their return and their honorable service. Yet, most black veterans returned to find that mainstream society dismissed their achievements and contributions. Especially in the South, white citizens used violence to remind black veterans of their second-class status in society. Whites even lynched some black veterans in their uniforms. Still, black veterans received recognition from their family, friends, and black communities. In experiencing life beyond the Jim Crow South, through their interactions in the North and overseas in Europe, many black veterans returned more determined to improve conditions for African Americans. While changes in American society did not occur immediately, black veterans, through their participation, staked their claim to full citizenship, fulfilled their patriotic duty, and proved their worth as men.